and we'll get started. Yeah. Let me know if you can see the share screen.
You're good.
Yep. Okay. Today, we're mostly going to focus on a foundational document for the Indigenous land management perspective of Yukon. That document is called Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. We'll get to know a little bit about it through this lecture. So we're going to talk about Mapping the Way, which is a really interesting kind of project that's ongoing in Yukon about self-governance and the path to self-governance. So I'll talk a little bit about that. We'll go through a general timeline provided by Mapping the Way. And we're going to talk about Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. I'm going to touch on, I'm not going to go through the whole umbrella agreement and self-government agreements, but I'm going to touch on the umbrella agreement and the self-government agreements. And then we're going to talk about tomorrow. So, trends that I think are leading to the future. So Mapping the Way, this is a Yukon First Nation self-governance. It's a website, it's a whole program that exists, and they've provided this timeline of events. I don't know if either of you have seen this before, but some general background. 1876, the Indian Act comes into force. So obviously starting pretty late, not talking about pre-colonial elements. Oh, Shirley Jack has joined us. Hello, Shirley. 1898, the Klondike Gold Rush brings thousands of gold seekers to the Yukon. 1902, Tonquichan Chief Jim Boss recognizes the effect of newly arrived settlers on Yukon First Nations. He writes to the government of Canada requesting compensation for his people's loss of land and hunting grounds. Moving on, the focus of today's lecture will be Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. This is a document that was presented in 1973 to the first Trudeau government, or the Pierre Elliott Trudeau government, by the Council of Yukon, the Council of Yukon Indians at the time, which would become the Council of Yukon First Nations. This is a document that outlines a whole bunch of things. We're going to get into it in depth today. And I think it's a really good document to get into depth with, because it shows a lot of the bridging between land management styles and an effort to, from the Council of Yukon Indians, to bridge that gap and to work within the colonial system, but to also express their frustrations with that in a really beautiful way, I think. 1993, the Council for Yukon Indians and the Government of Canada and the Government of Yukon signed the Umbrella Final Agreement. This is the framework agreement that allowed, and still allows, for Yukon First Nations to negotiate for self-governance. So when you hear the term umbrella agreement, it refers to the framework agreement. When you hear the term final agreement, that refers to any one First Nations specific agreement. So the government of Kwanlin Dun would have a final agreement that was negotiated under the umbrella agreements. The umbrella is the big one, and then the more specific ones are called final agreements. 1993 to 2005, final agreements, land claims were negotiated. These were, I believe, always negotiated with a self-government agreement, which is a more specific agreement that defines the self-governing powers of each First Nation. So today, Yukon First Nations are at the forefront of Aboriginal land claims and self-government in Canada. 11 of the 14 First Nations in Yukon have settled their land claims and are self-governing now. This represents approximately half all such agreements in Canada. So the Indian Act continues to apply to 3 Yukon First Nations. And then the whole thing of the self-governing First Nations. So we're going to talk about this document that was presented to the Government of Canada in 1973, Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. And then we'll have a little discussion at the end if you're up for it. So now this will all be provided through the course notes. Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow begins with the chapters yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Yesterday is a longer chapter than the other ones, and it explains, the pre-colonial way, the Indian way, as it is called in the book. So yesterday, the Indian way and land. It talks about how First Nations lived in small groups, moved around during different seasons, gathered in larger groups in summer. Spiritual beliefs taught First Nations to live as part of the land. Possessions belonged to the whole group. Individuals did not suffer unless the whole group was suffering. And then there's this quote: "We learned how to practice what is now called multiple land use, conservation, and resource management. We have much to teach the white man about these things when he is ready to listen." I think that, what better quote could you possibly have for a course like this? I think that I think that stands on its own, actually. I'm not going to comment on it because it's wonderful. Yesterday goes on to talk about the first white men, Russians who traded with coastal Indians. This is when the ideas of private ownership were first presented in Yukon. Trade with the Russians was unfair, highly weighted towards benefiting Russians, not Yukon First Nations. But the items that the Russians had to offer could not be acquired any other way. And conflict arose from the system of trade, especially because of the power imbalance at play. Yesterday, the second white man, the fur trader. Fur traders came to Yukon and offered a better price for furs than were offered before. This stopped trade between the inland and coastal First Nations, largely, not entirely. White men brought tea, sugar, flour, tobacco, and new tools to the Yukon. Then we'll talk about the third white man, the gold seeker. The Klondike Gold Rush saw an enormous rush of white people to Yukon. First Nations were guides, packers, and prospectors who saved many lives of the newcomers during this time. Many First Nations learned English and other new languages during this time. White people spread new religions, specifically Christianity, to First Nations during this time. First Nations began to be pressured to give up their spiritual beliefs. Ownership of personal items had become more common for First Nations during this time. Some First Nations gave up the quote unquote Indian way during this period. So you can see as more white people come into Yukon, they move away from systems of, kind of collective benefit and collective management. And ideas of private ownership and individualism are kind of pushed through both Christianity and the ideas of ownership of personal items. Between 1900 and 1930, over half of First Nation people died in Yukon from disease. Many returned back to the bush to practice their skills. Residential schools began to force First Nations to leave their culture spiritually and their way of life. Children were taken away from their families and homes and forced into residential schools. So the colonization continues. The fourth white man, the American soldier. Americans came to Yukon to build the Alaska Highway as part of the war effort for World War II. Indian Affairs came to create band lists and invented the Indian village. So this is the time when free mobility over the landscape started to become prohibited for First Nation people. This is often what caused a lot of the problems concerning the Indigenous economy and forced the Indigenous economy to collapse is because that economic system required that people were mobile across the landscape. And by forcing people into Indian villages, by limiting their mobility, they were also essentially forcing the Indigenous economy to collapse. Roads made Yukon more accessible to the outside world, and more urbanization occurred. Yesterday, the end of boats. So many First Nation people worked cutting wood for steamships, primarily up and down the Yukon River, but also on the Southern Lakes. With the development of highways and roads, the steamships were no longer needed. Wood camps were shut down, often very abruptly, leaving many First Nation people without work. Welfare was introduced. This was, it's an interesting kind of paradox where colonization forced the Indigenous economy to collapse and forced people to be reliant on a welfare system then. And many First Nation people had no other options, as they had no means of making money. They were prohibited from going out and using their skills, to trap or hunt or do any of the things that they knew how to do in order to provide for themselves and their families. So their only option was welfare at this point. And they were prohibited from going back on the land. In this era, potlatches were also outlawed, and many cultural practices were prohibited. Mining and oil. The Anvil mine in Faro, what is now, I believe, the second largest contaminated site on Earth, was developed in 1965 and saw another influx of white people to the Ross River area. Many First Nation people in the area left fur trading for jobs in the resource sector. This created conditions where First Nations were once again forced into dependence on white people, a white-owned mine where the wealth was coming from. First Nations were not compensated for their land in this time. The Faro mine, as I mentioned, second largest contaminated site on Earth, incredibly toxic landscape in, not formerly beautiful area still, but formerly very healthy wildlife populations that have been impacted by it. First Nations have never been compensated for the permanent damage to this landscape. The remediation for the Faro mine continues today. So it's kind of a sad story. So today, when this document was presented to the government of Canada, was 1973. Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow was prepared to explain to white people the situation that they have put First Nations into. And the document explains a lack of understanding and tolerance between First Nations and white people exist. This document was formed in consultation, a series of consultations that were done across Yukon, and I think is a really wonderful document that explains the kind of progressive colonization of the land and how it affects Yukon First Nation people. The document in its entirety is posted on Moodle if you're interested in reading it. It's not super long, but I wanted to, give this as a discussion. Today, the Indian way as the white man sees it. So I think that this is a really interesting frame for part of a chapter as well, because it demonstrates a willingness to have collaborative management. So they're talking about the different perspectives at play here. Racism of white people is shown through a lack of understanding of First Nations, a lack of willingness to, work together and understand each other's perspectives. Some white men complain, this is a quote, some white men complain that we don't want to stay in one place on one piece of land. This is because it is against our whole way of life. We are trying to learn your way, but being squeezed in by our neighbors, white or Indian, separates us from open land. We've never considered that we own a piece of land, but all lands were tribal lands. We only use it. When a white man fences off grazing leases on our trap lands, it makes us ask ourselves, why can't two different kinds of animals use the same piece of land? I think this is another wonderful quote from this document that really describes the difference in land management approaches and also articulates well the preferred Indigenous approach of land management. Why can't the land be used by multiple animals? Why do we have to fence it off? And again, talking about a more collaborative, collective action frame as opposed to something that's more based around private ownership and private property. So today, the white man way, as the Indian sees it, many Indians look at how the white man uses the ducks and moose that he kills. He does not show the same respect as we do. Another quote, we wonder how the white man can be so concerned about the future by putting money in the bank and still pays no attention to the future of the land if he can make a quick dollar from selling it to foreigners. Traditionally, the Indian did not have to store up goods for the future because he protected the resources that they would always be there. I think that's a wonderful, that second quote especially, it's a really good quote explaining that, if you create conditions where resources are going to be plentiful and that you support the ecosystems that support you, you don't have to worry about saving up. You don't have to have a surplus of things if there's always going to be kind of regeneration and regrowth. Yeah, I think the difference between what the consideration here of what wealth is, I think it comes into play here as well.
I have a funny little comment, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Just on the first quote there, it says, he does not show the same respect as we do. So just a short little story my dad used to tell me. So my dad is a residential school survivor, and when he was done school, like around this time when all that stuff was banned and they weren't allowed to hunt, they weren't allowed to drink, they couldn't leave the reserve and all that. And he told me that he used to go like walk from the reserve and into town, and like the non-Indigenous people would have like their moose outside of like a bar or wherever they were drinking. And so Clinkets, they eat like every part of the moose from the bum guts to the nose. And so he would sneak there in the nighttime and he would cut the nose off of their trophy moose, and they would like come out, and so they wouldn't be able to use the moose head as the trophy. And so then he would take the moose nose home and eat it with his family.
That's great. Yeah, I think there's a big difference. The whole idea of using moose head as a trophy in the first place, trophy hunting, the whole concept of it. It's wasteful. That's a great story. Okay, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about, actually, are there any other comments on Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, or questions about that? Did strike a chord for anybody before I move on? All right, I'm gonna move on then.
Sorry, this document, like the purpose behind it was so that they could plead the case that they should be able to negotiate agreements for themselves, right?
That's right. The purpose of the document was, to assert that they have a way of managing the land that works, and they have a way of managing themselves that works. And the system that white people had imposed on Yukon First Nations was not working.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think this document really does that well, which is great. It eventually would lead to the umbrella agreement being negotiated. It would be 20 years before that happened, but still, it was part of the journey to self-governance. Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, good point of clarification. Thanks. So I just have a quick point about self-governed agreements as well. Self-governance is a system, as many of you know, where Yukon First Nations, self-governance exists outside of Yukon, so First Nations can form their own governments and have greater control over their land, culture, and well-being. Self-government, however, does not reverse colonization. So the Umbrella Agreement, for example, has all of these distinct chapters. However, many colonial systems are still imposed through the framework of the whole thing, right? So self-government requires that First Nations are subject to the market economy. So it still requires certain elements of taxation, and it doesn't really do much to reverse the fact that money is a fact of life in this day and age. It requires that First Nations accept private ownership of resources and lands in that one's a bit different because there are settlement lands, and on those lands, First Nations are able to determine what the ownership style is. However, other lands, using Kwanlin First Nation, for example, as an example, their traditional territory, only 6% of it is settlement land. So on all of that land, on 94% of their traditional territory, the system of private ownership of lands exists. So in order to effectively manage all of those resources, caribou herds and things that pass through those lands, they don't have complete control over it. And there is a kind of market-based private ownership structure on those lands. First, self-government agreements also require that there are formal quote unquote lines on maps. For settlement lands, you have your finite parcel of land, and for traditional territories as well. So, these were more fluid concepts in a pre-colonial system, where you wouldn't have a hard and fast end to your traditional territory or an end to the land that you have control over. If Yukon First Nations wish to pass a law, those laws still have to be, formed in a way that suit the Canadian legal system. They have to be legally defensible, is the term that is often used. So pre-colonial systems of law and justice are, it's not impossible, and it does happen, but they're a bit different because they have to be codified, they have to be written down. So self-governance is many ways an opportunity for First Nations to regain control and more autonomy, but it does not undo this colonization. I think that this is something that is often overlooked, is the fact that colonization is still a fact. And that this is part of the healing process, is giving people control over their own lands and well-beings. I'd really like to know your thoughts on, on this, because it's an area of, of interest to me. I know it's something that I've had a lot of discussions with different land managers about, and I think it's one of the frustrations that, I've seen within some of the communities here, is that, we have self-governance now, why can't we go back to the old ways? And I think it's a fair point. There's still barriers to managing land in a properly pre-colonial kind of Indigenous way. And yeah. Are there any thoughts on that? Nope.
I'll get one comment on it, I guess.
Yeah.
That's very interesting that you worded it that way, because a lot of people talk about self-government, but they don't really kind of place it saying that it is under the colonial system. And so that's as you know, through other courses that we've gone through, that is the case. And but you know, sometimes, like I say, self-government seems to be shopped out in maybe not the correct terms, and it is following Westminster style. And I know Teslin, for instance, is changing that system, but at the end of the day, they still end up having to follow that federal or the territorial system, as you probably see all the time with your current job. And I guess that is kind of a struggle. How do you go forward from that, right? And I don't really have an answer right now myself personally, but yeah, that's a good point that you brought up.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about RELAW the other week. I think things like RELAW are starting to pop up where people are, now that they have self-governance, are able to get kind of creative and do things differently, and are challenging assumptions on what that Westminster system, you know, imposes on them. It takes time to get creative with a process like that. And it's, I think, incredibly difficult to do. But yeah, I think I mean, it's certainly a lot better than not having any control. You know, I don't mean to be overly critical of self-governance, because I think it is a step in the right direction. It's just maybe not, you know, a complete solution on its own. It requires further work to be done.
You might be able to answer this, because maybe we're going to get into it later in the weeks down the road. But a lot of nations, I think we're up to like 4 of them, that have their own land use planning in Yukon now. And I think I've been to a few meetings previously, a few years ago, and Little Salmon and Carmacks First Nation, for instance, they were getting theirs together. And there's a lot of traditional direction in it. And I was thinking kind of to the Peel somewhat, you know, how the Peel was basically, it wasn't a clear win in terms of the Supreme Court kind of left a few things undefined. However, but I think as nations create their own land use planning and kind of lay it out on the table, and then when the governments or business come knocking on a door saying, hey, we want to do this or this, you can say, well, we already did that land use planning and you have to follow our planning guide. I just wondering what your thoughts are, if it's gonna hold some strong weight on the future planning. So it's kind of like a more traditional land use model, I guess is what I'm getting at, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you're talking mostly about regional planning, like the big scale stuff.
Yeah. Like for instance, the Southern Lakes. I think Carcross recently done one, or actually in the process of doing one.
They're sort of in the beginning. Carcross, Tagish, Kwannon First Nation, and Ta'an Quechan Council are, I believe, partnering in the preparation phases for
so you see what my question is like, when you get that done, and when it comes time for, we'll say, a conflict with the government or industry, and you have your ducks in a row, and you've done your traditional law. Now, I guess the test will be there, whether that's going to be, you know, is that going to define yourself as your own self-government, right?
Yeah, I think it's, I'm personally hopeful that is I mean, as a planner, I hope that that's kind of what happens, because it gives value to the practice of planning. But I do think that large scale, you know, where you're talking with, you know, multiple different First Nation governments, I think that's the right place for it. That's where collective management comes into play properly, is when you have multiple groups who are all affected by the outcomes on how these resources are managed. So, you know, thinking back to the Eleanor Ostrom stuff and how collective management of resources can solve a lot of problems. I'm hopeful that that's the right way to do it. I also think that just at that scale itself, you're actually able to manage for things like, you know, a caribou herds, you know, kind of migration and things like that. Whereas a lot of the smaller scales of planning, you know, you might be able to manage, you know, 1 week of the caribou's migration or something like that. But it's just such a small piece of land that, you know, as caribou move through the landscape, yeah, you can make one place a sanctuary for them, but they don't need one place. They need to be able to move across the land and be healthy the whole way. So yeah, it's an interesting way to do it. We are going to talk a little bit more about the different planning scales and what's required in a land use plan. But I think another thing that people are really getting creative with now is challenging those assumptions on what the content and shape of a plan should even look like. You know, it wasn't long ago that there was a really set formal kind of framework for how all these plans would be developed and what they would look like. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that a lot of the time it's rooted in discussions with the community. What do you want to manage and how do you want to manage it? And that's kind of the starting place now, which I think is really positive.
Yeah, I agree. So in the past, from what my experience was, is that, for instance, the grizzly bear management plan and the wetlands, that was all, the terms of reference were all drew up by Yukon government, right? So it kind of they have the whole game out of the gate, and so they can control the direction right away. So sometimes I think you have to kind of get a hold of the terms of reference and get in there beforehand, right? Before they make the play on which way they want to go, because that it's just, if they make all the rules and they're just coming to you for consultation, and that you're not really part of the decision making, right?
That's right. You're not deciding. They're coming to you with you know, this little piece of information that you can contribute to, as opposed to coming to you and saying what needs to be managed and how do we do it. Just those open-ended type questions help frame up the entire issue. If Yukon government approaches a First Nation and says, "Hey, we've already decided, you know, what we're planning on managing, and we've already decided all of these things, and what we want to know is this little tiny piece of information," you're not effectively engaging people at all. You're asking for token surface level kind of input so that you can check a box. You're not asking for meaningful engagement.
Yeah, just a quick extra note on about the one plan I was involved with. We went to the public, and we requested public input online, right? And so we actually used quite a bit of that data, but I think it was only like 80 people got to put input on it, and a lot of the plan was kind of revolving around the feedback. So I'm thinking 80 people who are probably not even really representative of the community are getting to decide what's going on. So it's just kind of bizarre the way the business goes sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Anyway,
that's spectacular. You know, that many people coming out and voicing their perspectives has an impact.
Well, it is, and because that's where you basically draw your, you know, your evidence for how you think the Yukon public wants you to go forward, right? So, but meanwhile, it might be totally 180-degree turn from Indigenous law, but Yukon government goes with what they, you know, what they have, right? So it's, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that is a short one this week. I know. That's all I had. If there's any other discussion points or anything like that.
I kind of had a comment on self-government, like you asked us what our thoughts were about that.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think like self-government is, you know, a great step or whatever, but like until the effects of colonization are dealt with properly, like it's just not going to be completely successful the way it should be. Like it's so, like I can only speak for my community, but I'm sure many other First Nation communities are the same, but it's so like sink or swim, and a lot of our people are sinking, and then there's only so many that are swimming, and lots of people are still struggling with, you know, the effects of colonization, which is like the trauma and the addictions and being in poverty and all that. And so I just think until like people and communities are healing as a whole, like self-government won't really be what it should be, because you need the whole community for that. And so I just think that should be a priority, I guess.
I completely agree.
Like, yeah, in our community, like half the time you can't even get quorum for meetings, and you know, like people aren't participating, and we're not getting the input or feedback that we need to be moving forward. So it's only a handful of people contributing to this and deciding our nation's future in self-governance, or as a for the community and whatever. And so it's just completely unfair that people are being left behind, I guess, and people just need the healing. So I don't know, it's just sometimes sad.
Yeah, and thanks for that
And so in
perspective.
a sense, I guess,
Yeah.
yeah, and so I guess in a sense, like the development of self-governance is only defined and created for like a handful of people, which I don't agree with. Just because they're the ones that are doing good, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. I think that's a really valuable perspective. I think, you know, self-government, it's a big challenge. It requires that people have a lot of knowledge. You know, never before have I been in a room, you know, before working for Kwantlen First Nation, I'd never been in a room with so many people who understood so much about Canadian law, you know, as you know, with regular people from the Kwantlen community. And it's kind of, you know, it's unfair to expect that regular people have to understand such technical things in order for them to reclaim their own culture and live their own lives. It's a big challenge. Are there any other thoughts on that? Thanks, Shirley. Yeah.
Can I just add one further comment?
Sure.
But I'm not too sure if you'll be able to answer this, because it's kind of like the kind of what Shirley's talking about somewhat, maybe the progress of I went to one Southern Lakes Caribou meeting, Southern Lakes Caribou meeting, yeah, Caribou herd meeting, and I was kind of surprised that they've been working on it for many, many years, right? And the herd is quite threatened,
Mhm.
and the results are kind of really hard. There's consensus seems to be a really difficult thing, and so it's not only the government or or industry that's part of the problem, but it's also within our own nations too, right? We just don't seem to collaborate all that great sometimes. And I think part of the UFA, unfortunately, is once everybody signed their agreement, they went their own way and they kind of closed the door on their partnerships. You know what I mean? So because everybody has their own government and they're dealing with their own, they got their head down, they're working hard, right? So the collaboration, even though CYFN's there, they don't get involved in, you know, overlap issues and stuff. Like they deal with specific stuff. But so there's a bit of conflict with that overlap kind of concept too, right? And as you and I'm not asking you for an answer, but because you're probably part of those meetings. But so there is some struggle, I think, even with the design of the final agreement, or the UFA, I mean, is the fact that it inherently causes conflict, the fact that there's overlap and competing interest on resources and land, or, you know, I guess they kind of turn, with a colonial structure, turned you kind of against your own brothers and sisters next door, right? So that's kind of the thing I noticed that was kind of disappointing when I went to a few meetings, and it is a struggle I'm sure you see all the time and a lot of other people see. But I'm not too sure how you get around that, but it's not good to be wasting all your energy. Meanwhile, the lands and your wildlife is kind of getting hurt or run down on the highway all the time, right?
Yeah, you know, I think back to the example that Ryan brought up a few weeks ago of, you know, again, I think it was also Caribou, multiple First Nations with different management approaches to caribou. Is that correct, Ryan? Yeah. And yeah, I think, you know, it's the same story over a lot of different resources. You know, it could be caribou, it could be salmon. Yeah, it's I don't know. It requires a lot of discourse. It requires a lot of difficult discussions. And I mean, I can't answer your question because I actually, not because I'm part of any meetings or anything, just because I don't know what the solution there is or how it ought to be done.
Yeah, well, maybe the key will be in those regional land use plans. Maybe that's where the key will be, right?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think that might be part of the solution. I think that there have to be multiple approaches taken to these things. And I think the biggest thing that that I see in at least my immediate work is good community engagement, meaningful community engagement, encouraging, you know, not only people to come out, but encouraging people to be able to express themselves in ways that they're comfortable. And yeah, you know, keeping the community involved from the very beginning all the way through to the implementation, and making sure that the community feels like it's their plan and it's not something that a government has, you know, imposed on them. It's not another you know, bureaucratic thing. It's something that really represents their voice. And the only way to do that is to have good community discussions with people, keep them involved, and to accurately represent their voice in the plan. Not creatively interpret what they're saying or something like that, but to really, you know, take quotes, take what that community is saying, and put it on paper and make it into a plan and make it into policy.
Yeah, that sounds like that is the way to go.
I'm glad you agree. Yeah. Yeah, are there any other discussion points for today?
I guess I just have one question. I guess I don't, I know that here in the Northwest Territories, we have like a bunch of different land claims and self-government agreements. I guess I'm just trying to understand the umbrella agreement even further. Is it a land claim agreement? And then
It is a land claim agreement, yes.
Okay, alrighty, okay. Yeah, I really, and I'm looking at the quote tomorrow. Sorry, I can't. It's a long name. It says here that the Yukon Indian people used over 90% of the total land. Today, we will still use most of that land. We are not asking you to give us back our land. We are asking you to let us keep and develop some of our land. I just like, I can't imagine like being there when this was presented to like the government of Canada, like how powerful that must have been. I to think about, like, you know, like there's hundreds of First Nations doing the same thing, and it's like, it's, I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've actually thought about that myself, you know, like to be a fly on the wall there, see the reaction that would have gotten. It would have been pretty good, I think. And I think it's an incredibly powerful document. And yeah, it's informed a lot of kind of my context coming into this world as a person of settler, you know, origins, and trying to understand, yeah, you know, how to navigate this world in an appropriate way. So yeah, thanks guys. That was a really good discussion.
Thank you.
All right, I think be happy to call it a day there. Yeah, Shirley, I don't think you were here at that point, but next week we're going to be doing a workshop around you know, traditional stories and land management, how you know, by reading and investigating you know, traditional stories, we can learn a lot about land management. Then there's reading week, so you guys don't have to do anything. There will be an assignment over reading week. I've decided to extend the deadline for that. I'll put it all up on Moodle for you so that if you don't want to do it over reading week, you'll have an extra week. And then there'll be
Nice.
well, I know how reading week goes. And then the following week we're going to be doing a guest lecture and talking about salmon management in Yukon and Alaska. And that guest lecture I'm very excited about. I think it's going to be great. Yeah, and that's all I've got for you today.
Okay, see you, everybody.
See you guys.
Thank you. Good night.
You.